Welcome everyone to our virtual artist talk with Rachelle Krieger, who is the featured artist in our solo show, These In-Between Days. And we're delighted that during this pandemic, we could put this show together and have her beautiful new work that's all been created during the pandemic. Rachelle and I first met early on. I think we were trying to figure it out in maybe 2006, 2007 at an art fair. And we had our first show together at Susan Eley Fine Art in 2010. And since then, she's had many group shows and solo shows in the gallery. And we've taken her work to Miami for art fairs and New York and Toronto. Rachelle is from Queens, New York, and now lives in Port Washington, New York. She has a BFA from Pratt Institute and has since then studied at the New York Studio School, Art Students League. And we're so happy to welcome her here today. And behind the camera is Emily Miraglia, who's gallery associate. And please bear with us because we've never done anything like this before, as you could see by the way I signed on. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat room and we will get to them during the talk and also at the end of the talk. So Rachelle, tell us first what sparked the creation of this beautiful new work and when did you start painting this series?
Well, first off, I wanted to say thank you to Susie for being such a support to me and my work over all of these years, and to be able to showcase my work in this beautiful space has really been an honor over the years. So thank you very much. Most of these paintings were done in 2020 over the lockdown during the pandemic. As you know, many of us found ourselves locked in. Nowhere to go, nothing to do, which is actually kind of a painter's paradise. However, after being thrown into that, I was a little bit jarred by that's where, finding that's where we were. And I really started to think about nature and resilience and using that as a metaphor for helping get through those times. But the series actually started prior to the pandemic. And I have to say, it really started with a very personal exploration, personal changes. Dare I say the word menopause, something that is kind of taboo. People don't really talk about. And it's interesting to me because it's something that should be celebrated. It's a change in life that should be empowered and empowering instead of a taboo. And so in many ways, that pause kind of reflected on the pause that we were all forced to go into, where it was a time of self-reflection, a time of change, a time of resilience, and a time of how are we going to get through this? How are we going to get through this together? And the first paintings that I want to take you and show you are small paintings, small things. Good things sometimes come in small packages, and these were really where I started to bring tree elements back into my work, and I started to use these elements as a metaphor for connection, in looking at dead or dying branches, and how they connected or interconnected or didn't touch each other. And how this was very, very, very early spring when everything was bare. Now, it kind of left me wondering, what is going to bloom? What is alive? What's the state of life? How are these branches going to become, if they become, and how are they relating? And then also thinking about the space between the branches. So it's not just about the line and the form, but it's also about all of the energy between them and behind them. And then once, I like to work large and I like to work small. Some of the work is painted outside. Some of it is painted outside and also then brought into the studio. This painting, actually, these were completely in the studio, and this one was started outdoors. So these are all acrylic with oil as the branches. This larger one, I started to really do larger pieces, very immersive. I wanted to have a sense of expansion and light and airiness. Also examining, once again, the branches being, are they kind of like ghost images of branches that were alive, brambles that are kind of surrounding a space, and how do we react to the clearing? The title of this painting is The Clearing, and how does that space envelop us? Did you
So,
have any other?
Rachelle, yeah, so you said that you've moved back outside. So there was a period in your earlier work when you were making most of the work in the studio. That's fascinating that during this time of introspection and isolation and during the pandemic, you had this need to move back into nature. And also your earlier series of work was more abstract and moving away from very obvious references to natural elements. So now you really are bringing the foliage, trees, tree trunks, branches back in. Do you think that this is a direction that you will stay in, or do you think you might move back into more abstraction?
I am I'm always drawn to nature. I think the one common thread that all of my work has is an examination of nature, whether it leans towards more representational versus more abstract, or more ethereal versus more sturdy and steady and solid. For instance, so these two paintings, the works that I did on paper tend to be more explorations of how I'm going to use new material sometimes. So this is where I started to work out some of the ideas that I had in my previous series, where I was examining a lot more of what was going on invisibly in the atmosphere, and the spray paint helped me capture that ethereal quality. But the elements that steadied the entire composition and the painting and the structure were the trees, or playing with the paint as foliage and using that as a kind of playful metaphor, but also grounding us. This one is called Cornucopia, and it kind of sums up an idea that there's gratitude for an abundance. So in nature, there is an abundance and this cornucopia, and it's just that we have to go and appreciate it and find it. A good example of the question that you're asking is this piece. It's called Source, and this was probably a piece that I had the most difficult time painting, and if it doesn't sell, I'm actually going to keep it for my own personal collection because I somehow am very attached to this painting. Even though I wrestled with it, and not all paintings, paintings come in different ease or difficulty. This one happened to be more difficult, but I started with this atmosphere in the spray paint and in these drips that are kind of planned drips. And on top of that, I started to anchor the entire painting with this oil that I just swept through the entire painting. So giving more of a solidity to not only the atmosphere, but also the trees, which I'm hoping, ground us. So even though it was like a battle with chaos, and just taking those trees almost as this kind of like almost a self-portrait in a way of feeling steady and resilient, and how can we all just be healed and feeling steady through this like kind of chaotic time. And this kind of also—
That's very interesting that you just said it feels a bit like a self-portrait, because as you're standing in front of this painting source, I almost feel like you're guided, that you're almost in walking through that landscape, and that's what the monumental scale brings.
That's very interesting. That's one of the things that I had hoped in working on this body of work, was that it would envelop people and immerse the viewer in an environment of being in a forest, in a, you know, sometimes a dark and scary forest, or whimsical, or just relating to nature, and a forest showing all of biodiversity and life changes in different stages. So these three, back to some three smaller paintings. These paintings were inspired by walking at night in the rain. I've been spending so much time walking in nature. Also, if I'm not painting, I'm walking. And these, it was just twilight and it's raining, and there's this super saturation that comes to the colors. I don't know if you've ever noticed when after it rains or during rain, the colors just really come out, and everything just, it's almost like the plants are saying thank you. Another little thing that I want to mention is that the edge of my work, you know, I do give a lot of thought to certain details, and that edge, it's kind of a hint. I always love looking at the edge of an artist's work, because it's kind of a hint to the process, and you can see how the piece was started. So the piece was started with drips, and it was flat. So you can tell that it was flat by the way the drips on the sides are going. You can tell that it was sprayed because of the spray on the sides. And then you can tell that afterwards I painted with this darker acrylic that kind of just did a little bit of illustrating maybe clouds or rain. So I love an edge where you can really see an artist's process, and it's kind of like a hint to seeing what happened first. And also
so talking about process, sorry to interrupt, just I want to emphasize for everyone to hear that Rachelle is using oil paint, acrylic paint, oil bar, and spray paint, all on either panel, paper, or canvas. So I think that's important to note, the masterful skill that she has to go in and out of those different materials and layer the color and shapes down, I think is remarkable. And in fact, in these small paintings, those bright colors that you're talking about, to me, evoke graffiti. I don't know if anyone else feels that. One question from Connie. Hi, Connie. How do you prep your canvases or your panels?
Well, if I'm only painting on oil, with oil, then I used to use oil primed. I always use linen. I just prefer linen. I like working on, and I used to work on board. Depends on really what I'm going to be using. But if I use any acrylic at all, it has to be prepped with a gesso, so that it's not an oil only gesso. It's an acrylic based gesso. So getting into this painting, this also, I think, harks back to the series that I did beforehand, where most of the emphasis was on elements that are unseen. And so many of these paintings were done during the time of the California wildfires, and thinking about embers and thinking about ominous, unseen forces. And in this case, I'm layering the branches, and all of these sweeping elements can be wind or air with foliage, but most of this the acrylic only paintings are very transparent. And when I get into applying with oil, like these two, similar to my self-portrait one called Source, I took the underlayer using spray paint, so you get a very, very ethereal quality, and it's almost like pointillism underneath. And then this upper layer is actually with sometimes a squeegee, sometimes not so much a palette knife, but even just pieces of cardboard. Sometimes I'll take paint on it like a small squeegee, and I'll just push it around and create this opacity, but also a luminous quality. So it's sometimes a little bit tricky to have oil be as luminous as you want it to be. So there is an element of challenging myself with the medium as well. And it's also a texture. So all of the extra layering and texture comes from the oil application. All of the oil bar and drawing is also oil-based, but all of this behind the scenes kind of stuff up here is very atmospheric, and that's with spray paint. Oh,
And
one thing that
can we talk a little bit about, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, but can you go back to talking about the hot colors that you've chosen for this series? And you did reference the wildfires on the West Coast. What else has been the impetus for this new palette?
Many times I love color, first of all. I'm a huge fan and relative of Rothko. And so there are some, artists or things that just pull me. And many times it's just instinctual. So in this case, I felt maybe the need for color. It's really just a matter of how can I use the materials, something as vivid as the spray paints and as exciting as the spray paints, but also anchor that with something that's a very neutral color like the branches. So just the balance of the two. I felt like maybe that's just where I needed to be. And so for these are probably the two smallest of the show. And these are called Suburban Paradise 1 and 2. And I think everybody was kind of, going into nature at some point and embracing, if they lived in suburbia or, just trying to get out of the city a little bit. Even if you lived in the city, you were going to a park maybe, or looking at flowers. And, many people were just finding that very healing, during these more difficult days. And these were painted right in my backyard. I'm fortunate to have some nice nature right in my backyard. And typically when I'm painting directly from nature, they tend to be a little bit more representational. So you typically don't see in my work pretty representational images of flowers and leaves, but in this case you do. And I just got so immersed in the process of painting these. And for me, painting outside is my meditation. It's something that is a magical space for me. It's being in the zone, in the flow. I feel like I could just stand there, and I'm almost always standing when I'm painting outside. And just to be in a place outdoors where I can be still and be quiet and be observing for hours and hours. And it's interesting to see how nature responds to my presence there. Many times birds are kind of taken aback by my presence until they kind of get curious. They actually come by and want to know what's going on. And sometimes we get some insects and they'll get stuck in the oil, which happens. But so we can now, if Susie, you have another question in this room, or shall we go to the next room?
Well, I just wanted to point out one thing about the Suburban Paradise Pear behind you. I want everyone to know that those are very small but very powerful paintings. They're 14 by 11 inches each. And I personally, these are my favorite paintings in the whole show. And they're some of the smallest. And there's something about the palette of them that feels very mid-century, very vintage. I don't know why, but the palette is different. And I'm very drawn to the fact that you seem to paint in pairs. Is that just how I curated it, or do you do that? I think you do that.
It's both, actually, because one trick that I have, if anybody is a painter or an artist out there, or even any type of artist, one of my kind of tricks that I like to share is that I always have extra canvases. So I never want to have too few canvases to be working on at one time, because then I feel like I will overwork one canvas, where if I have multiple pieces that are available for me to be working on, I can just move on and it'll be fresher than just being stuck with one. So I am frequently working on many paintings at a time. And they do seem to relate together to be a certain size, because I'm working out maybe one idea, and sometimes it takes 3 together to work out one idea. These are also, I want to mention the importance of music in my life, and music as a source of inspiration and just that lifts my soul and spirit. These are called Turn, Turn, Turn. And it's a kind of a play on words, because turn, turn, turn. Yes, all of the branches are turning in different directions. But also it's an homage to Pete Seeger and the song Turn, Turn, Turn. And that song kind of sums up also, you know, there's a season for all of the changes, and we can all sing along to that. So music.
That's great.
In my work. And my
We did have
titles.
one more question, Rachelle, that came earlier when you were talking about the painting's source, just before we leave this room.
This one?
Adrian asked, why was this one difficult? Why will you sometimes have a challenge with a painting and others will come more easily?
That's a good question, and I'm not really sure why. I'm not even sure why that happens. I think some paintings just come easily, and there they are, and I make them, and I feel like, yes, that is what I want to be saying, and it expresses that clearly. For some reason, this one was just always just wanting to be something different. I don't know, maybe there was like a wild nature to it, where you want to try to tame something, but it can't be tamed. And so it's kind of like embrace the part of it that can't be tamed and just branch out around the untamed parts and accept them. So I'm not sure why that happens. I think that might just be life. I mean, they can't all come that easily, I guess. So are we ready to, would you like to go into the other room, or do you have any other questions in here?
Let's go to the other room.
Sure. I'm so glad to have you all with me tonight. I hope you didn't have far to go. It's nice to not have to commute, right? And you know, in this environment, you can really like step into the paintings. This is another one of the very large paintings. It's the same size, I think it's 80 inches. And this one is called Walking the Path in Wonder. And I think I read an article in the New York Times about how if we can take a walk with a sense of wonder and look at everything as if we're examining it for the first time, or you know, seeing it with fresh eyes, then it'll give us like a whole new sense of appreciation for life. And that's kind of like what I was thinking about when I titled this piece and what I made when I made this piece, and just like a celebration and a sense of awe of nature. And this is almost entirely spray paint. And I'm also using, in this case, some graffiti material. So I did get into the act of spray paint, and some of these other materials are very physical, especially working on a painting this large. It happens to be a very physical experience. I have to get up on a ladder to reach the top. I do have these elements of these drips coming down. If you look at the drip, it's an intentional drip. I am putting those drips in there to allude to energy and almost electricity, sparks of electricity. So really that's almost the first thing that goes down are these drips. And I take the canvas and I tilt the canvas and I get all of these drips in this gridded pattern. And what I like about that is that there's an element of chance to how they're going to drip. You just cannot completely control like life, where it will flow and how it will flow. And you just kind of have to go with it and, you know, sometimes make the best of it. These are actually markers that you fill with a very fluid acrylic paint. And they're all made for fine artists now. They used to only be made for, you know, outdoor spray paints, but these are all fine art materials specifically made for indoor and fine art use. So they're very good quality. But basically, to get these very thin lines and strokes, this is not a brush. This is with this like graffiti marker. And all of this is with a graffiti marker. These are applied with stencils that I had made. Most of this was painted outdoors. If there are any questions I can answer specifically, I'm happy to answer some questions.
So we can turn on any sound if anyone wants to ask a question or put it in the chat.
Hi, I don't have a question necessarily, perhaps, but I'm Liz. I work at the CIFA location in Hudson. And I feel like for me, like your paintings evokes 3 strains of art history so effectively, like the way you talk about like this on plein air painting, right? It's so much like John Constable's cloud studies from the 1820s. And I love that strain of it. And then mashing it up with like action painting as well. And like Abax painting, like from the 50s, and then even like contemporary graffiti people. I think the way you use acrylic and spray paint is so like gorgeous. I'm just visually seeing like Mint and Surf and all of those kind of graffiti duos. So I guess to formulate some kind of coherent question, this like range of sources that you're bringing in from something that would be like an on plein air Constable cloud study, and like the way you approach initially being out in the landscape with your canvases, to your use of super contemporary, like quick materials. If you have anything to like say about like this range of influences or the speed that you paint when you're outdoors, I'd be super interested in that.
It's interesting. Thank you so much for pointing out all of those fabulous sources, because yes, I am inspired by all of those movements, and if I think about music as well, being, you know, sometimes I'll be listening to classical music. Sometimes I'll listen to opera. Sometimes I'll listen to rap. Sometimes I'll listen to jazz. And it kind of maybe, you know, influences also as in like a mishmash in a way of, you know, just coming to a place where I'm just singing my own voice. So I thought I heard you ask a question about speed of something, but I couldn't quite
Yeah,
get.
I guess thinking like when you're outside with a large canvas, like how that figures into, I mean, not that the speed of it actually matters, but just out of my own curiosity, how you navigate that, like the on plein air versus the rapidity of like graffiti artists and like that kind of.
Right. So it's interesting because the materials themselves dictate the speed in a way because so oil will take sometimes weeks to dry. As a matter of fact, this painting, because it's so thickly applied, it was delivered here wet. It's dry now. It's completely dry, but it was so thick. But many times I'll go out with watercolors, and that will dictate the speed also, because you really don't spend much, you know, you want to capture the light or something, an element, and it also depends on the weather, whether will it start raining, then I have to paint very quickly because watercolors will not hold up at all. So it's really about being in the elements, which excites me a lot. When I'm outside painting, I'm thinking about all of those things. If it's too windy, in a previous series, I think the first series that Susie had in my work in an exhibit here, very large paintings were all painted outside, and I had to tie the paintings to trees just to keep them from blowing over. And those were oils, and I would go back and forth with them, and I was able to store them in this like, little shed. So I would go back and forth with those. You know, it really depends on the materials and the weather. And also on whether or not a painting is just, you know, coming to me quickly, or whether I'm kind of now taking it back to my studio and working on it again.
Well, we have a question in the chat from Mindy. How do you quiet your mind to get into this incredible creative zone?
Good question. Well, because painting is meditative, in painting outdoors and observing nature quiets my mind, because I'm not even really, it's not even thinking that I'm doing. I'm not, if something pops into my head, it's like in meditation. I'm just kind of like, I let that thought go. And it's just a matter of observing. I think through that observation, my mind quiets. It's funny that you asked that question, because in traditional meditation, when people traditionally have their eyes closed, that's when I have a more difficult time quieting my mind for some reason, because I don't know, all of these things kind of like come into my head. But when I'm in nature and I'm just immersed in nature and I'm just enveloped in all of that energy, I feel like whatever's going on in my mind is just trivial. So it just flits away. So I just become, it's almost like it's like entering the flow, kind of. Specifically during painting in general, not even just painting outdoors, but painting in general, but especially outdoors.
So Rachelle, I also think we have to ask you what influence climate change plays in this body of work and in your work in general, because it's so nature-based.
Tremendous thoughts on climate change. I think also maybe that dictated some of the neon qualities of the palette. You know, I had mentioned that many of these were painted during California wildfire. So, many cases I'm looking at, embers, and so we're looking at, some of the repeated background images of embers, and yeah, it's a huge, huge concern. There's another painting, a small painting in the other room that you can see on Susie's website. It's called Toxic Swamp with Wildflowers. And just try to find, thinking about climate change can just be daunting, but to think about what are the small things that we can do, even if it's just this conversation. What can we do to, increase our awareness, increase others' awareness, and appreciation for the environment. So yes, climate change is definitely a factor in my work.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. It was great that you braved the snowstorm to come to the gallery today to do this talk, and Emily for filming it, and Eley for your support. So good night, everyone. And thank you all so much for joining. I'm really delighted to see people who collect Rachelle's work. I see Deborah with a beautiful painting of Rachelle's behind her. Love that. So thank you all very much, and see you next time.